Yes. You can also pick up a new mask for yourself or to give to others in the community. Start up from the beginning? Okay. Do you want me to just stay here and start? Okay, will you just do that when you're ready? Oh. Good morning. My name is Robin Carter, and I'm delighted to be here this morning to share with you a few announcements from the board. I'm new to the board this year, and I'm honored to serve in the position of President-elect on the Board of Trustees of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Spartanburg. Friends, members, and YouTube subscribers, thank you for joining us via live stream this morning. We've been at this for almost 5 months now, and we continue to monitor data and apply guidance from global and national health authorities. As such, all in-person church gatherings remain suspended. But just because we are apart doesn't mean there's not still plenty of ways that we can serve together. The UUCS Social Justice Committee has been hard at work to respond to the needs made even more urgent by this pandemic. The need for families to receive food assistance is very great in Spartanburg at the moment. So instead of Share the Plate this week, we will host a food drop by members and friends at UUCS to benefit Total Ministries. Today, August 9th, from 5 to 7 p.m., and again this Tuesday, August 11th, from 10 a.m. to noon. Here's how it will work. First, check the happenings email from last Thursday for a preferred list of items for this food drive. Then, bring your packaged or canned food items to the UUCS parking lot. Volunteers will greet you there and unload your donations and load them into the vans for Total Ministries. Then, park your car in the church lot, don your mask, and shop from tables located in the shade of the big tree. Plan to use the hand sanitizer before handling any of the items for purchase. Items include coffee, chocolate, T-shirts, and even some new note cards displaying the artwork from the newly completed Grimke mural. Plan to use cash or check made payable to UUCS. You can also pick up a new mask for yourself or to give to others in the community. Suggested donation is $5, but that will be cash only, as that money will help the UUCS sewing team be able to purchase new supplies. Our religious education team has also been super busy this summer, and I encourage you to check out the August Unison for many ways families and children can continue to connect. Sybil will be offering Sunday morning Zoom preschool story time and a time for all ages. These programs continue through December, and there is so much thought and care put into these. I hope parents and children in our congregation are able to join in. Our care for one another and for our community is even more critical now. I encourage you to visit our website, uucs.org, for ways you can join in. The Help button hosts a wealth of ways to get involved, from holding our elected officials accountable with advocacy calls that you can make each month, to ways you can give of your time or financial resources, even when we aren't gathered together. If you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, any of our board members, any of our staff. We are honored to serve this blessed community alongside each of you. We're glad you've taken this time this morning to connect with us. Let's continue to check in on family and friends, check in with the faces that you miss seeing on Sunday morning, care for each other by keeping your distance and wearing a mask. We are a people of faith and hope. Let's continue to hold tight to our covenant to one another. Welcome.
Well, welcome. My name is Palma Eisner, and I'm serving as your worship associate this morning. Thank you for joining us. Our church offers our ministers a sabbatical in the summer to rest and recoup, and this year it was really necessary. Next Sunday, our minister, Scott Neely, will return to this pulpit recharged and ready to offer us an insightful meditation on the 19th Amendment of the United States Constitution. As co-chair of the worship team, I am thankful to the 7 creative, articulate, and knowledgeable women who have filled Scott Neely's shoes this summer. I am thankful to Erin Galloway, who pre-recorded today's music and who has been singing and playing the piano for us since we began our live streaming. I am thankful to my fellow worship associates for their planning and partaking in our services, and the board members who make the announcements. Last but not least, I am thankful for the singers, musicians, and the crew who work tirelessly every Sunday to create our live stream services. So today, one of these 7 creative women I mentioned is Mary Miles. She's a birthright Unitarian. Having grown up at All Souls Unitarian Church in Indianapolis, she has been a member of 5 other UU congregations, including twice here at UUCS, from 1978 to 1986, and again starting in 2005 when she and her husband Don returned to Spartanburg to retire. Mary's careers have included public library management, nonprofit management, and from 1995 to 2005, stewardship and development with the Unitarian Universalist Association in Boston. Since retiring, she served in various capacities within the UUCS. She helped reactivate Mental Health America of Spartanburg, where she currently serves on the advisory board, and she is a member of the League of Women Voters in Spartanburg County. She and Dawn have an adult daughter, Elizabeth, who lives in Greenville with their grand dog, Rosie, and grand cat, Hester. So as we light the chalice, I will be reading a quote from Susan B. Anthony. She is the topic of today's meditation. Men, their rights and nothing more. Women, their rights and nothing less. I declare to you that women must not depend upon the protection of man, but must be taught to protect herself. And there I take my stand. There never will be complete equality until women themselves help to make laws and elect lawmakers. Our covenant, written by this congregation, guides the way in which we live in relation to one another. These words, powerful when they were written, continue to gain power as our congregation has truly embraced these words. Hear them and know that they are intentional. Know that we take them very seriously as we strive to create the world that we know is possible. So let's join our voices here and at home to speak the truth of our covenants. We are a people of faith and hope. Together we covenant to strive to become our better selves, to honor both the critical mind and the generous heart, to prove that diversity need not mean divisiveness, and to respond to systems of violence and oppression with the power of love beyond belief. We bring our gifts. Please visit our website at UUCS. Below the live stream, you will see a button that says Help. This page is updated weekly and contains numerous ways you can share your gifts, from action to letter writing to litter pickup to financial donations. Give to the church or donate to one of the many funds we support. Participate in the social justice triple dip today and Tuesday. Donate food, pick up masks sewn by our mask team, and purchase coffee and chocolate. This is the time in our live service when we would share our joys and concerns by visiting the Rippling Bowl, to hold one another in care and to share what's in our heart. We invite you now to share silently with your community and know that here your joys and concerns are held by all of us. We also use this time to greet one another. Although we are physically separated, there are still ways that we can connect with each other. Take a moment to send a greeting to others, perhaps a text, an email, or just a thought of those in our community. I have missed this being in this precious space on Sunday mornings. I was here last month and again today. Entering this sanctuary fills my heart with warmth and love. But to paraphrase Hamilton, you don't have to be in the room where it happens to feel a connection. Close your eyes and embrace the feeling of fellowship that I am sending to all of you here and at home. The words of hymn number 112, Do You Hear, were written by Emily L. Thorne, who lived from 1915 to 2004. She was a lifelong advocate of social causes and liberal education, an early supporter of the need for public kindergarten in Delaware. She was staff director of the Delaware Preschool Association from 1951 to 1955. From 1955 to 1975, she served as the director of religious education for the First Unitarian Church in Wilmington, Delaware.
Through the sky, through the land, do you hear, in the heights on the plain, in the vale on the main, in the sun, in the rain, do you hear, through the roar, through the rush, through the throng, through the crush, do you hear in the hush of your soul, hear the cry, fear won't still, hear the heart's call to will, hear the sigh, starling trill, in your soul, from the place where you stand to the outermost strand, do you hear, oh my friend, do you hear, all the dreams, all the dares, all the sighs, all the prayers, they are yours, mine and theirs, do you hear,
I am honored to be Mary Miles' sidekick today. We have worked together on many committees, and she always goes above and beyond all that she tackles. Well, you know what? Today is no exception, because somehow Mary was able to go back in time. She found a time machine, and she was able to get a guest speaker here. I am thrilled to welcome Susan B. Anthony to our church.
Thank you, Palma. Good morning, everyone. I'm really appreciative of Mary Miles for her kind invitation for me to speak with you today. I'm sure that she would have done an admirable job telling you about my life and times, but perhaps having a first-hand account will provide insight you would not otherwise have. First, may I say that I'm very happy to be back in the Unitarian Church. Although I grew up as a Quaker, I became a Unitarian as an adult and began attending First Unitarian Church in Rochester, New York around 1849. Coincidentally, Mary and her husband joined First Unitarian Church 137 years later. Mary likes to give her account of coming face to face with me for the first time when she walked into the foyer of First Unitarian Church in Rochester and saw my full-length portrait hanging on the wall in front of her. The portrait you see here of me is when I was much younger. Next to it is my red shawl, which was something I was known for when I gave a speech. One time, I decided to wear a black one, and the reporters covering my talk put down their pens, refusing to take notes until I sent someone to my hotel room to get my red shawl. Now back to the beginning. I was born the second of 7 children on February the 15th, 1820 in Adams, Massachusetts, which is near the New York state line. My father, Daniel, was a Quaker, and his marrying my Baptist mother, Lucy Reed, caused quite a stir, especially in his very conservative meeting. Nevertheless, my mother and father agreed to raise their children as Quakers, but in a more progressive branch of the faith. Being raised in this faith tradition has had a significant impact on my life in thinking about equality and individual rights. You see, Quakers respected woman's equality with men before God and in the home. And as a child, I took it for granted that such equality existed everywhere. I learned soon enough that this was not so. It was in elementary school that I first experienced the inequality between males and females. I really enjoyed math and wanted to learn how to do long division, but I was told by my teacher, a girl needs to know how to read her Bible and count her egg money, nothing more. Well, my father was quite angry when I told him about this, since he felt that all people, regardless of gender, had a right to a full education and skills to earn a living. So he took all his children out of this school and set up a home school for us with a teacher, Mary Perkins, who taught us girls and boys as equals. Father owned a mill at the time, a cotton mill, and his employees' children also attended the school. In 1837, when my sister Guelma and I were attending one of the country's few female boarding schools near Philadelphia, the economy collapsed. My father lost his mill and virtually all of our family possessions. Guelma and I were forced to return home as there was no longer any money to pay for the school. I helped my family however I could, and eventually I took a teaching position in a Quaker girls' school in New Rochelle, New York, to bring in money. I ended up spending the next 10 years of my life taking various teaching jobs to support myself, although I really never felt as if teaching was my true calling. With an inheritance received by my mother, my family purchased a 32-acre farm near Rochester, New York in 1845. There, we became associated with a group of Quaker social reformers, and our farmstead soon became a gathering place for local activists in the anti-slavery movement. The conversations I heard opened a whole new world for me. I learned about the Underground Railroad and the fugitive slave law, and soon realized that some of our neighbors' farms were stations on the Underground. My father and I read anti-slavery tracts and copies of William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, and discussed the issues they raised during long winter nights by the fire. The following year, I received an offer to become head of the girls' department at Canajoharie Academy near Albany. Although I was reluctant to leave my family and the farm, I accepted the position, which paid an annual salary of $110. More money than I had ever earned in my life. I took the long trip from Rochester to the village of Canajoharie by canal boat and moved in with my cousin Margaret Reed Caldwell in May of 1846. I missed my family terribly, but Canajoharie was so far from Rochester that I didn't get home the first 2 years I taught there. Instead, I spent my vacations with my sisters, Guelma and Hannah, who lived just a few hours away, or in Albany with a former teacher from my boarding school, Lydia Mott. Lydia was a cousin by marriage of Lucretia Mott and was also an active abolitionist. So I learned a great deal about anti-slavery work from her during these visits. When I lived in Canajoharie, the temperance movement was becoming more prominent then than the anti-slavery one. temperance was very much a women's rights issue because laws gave husbands complete control of the family and its finances, leaving wives with virtually no legal recourse if the husband was abusive or spent most of his income on alcohol. I had long been an advocate of temperance, which my parents had always championed, so I decided to get more involved in that cause. Another learning experience for me. The Sons of Temperance was organizing throughout the country and gaining strength, but the men refused to admit women, telling us reform was outside women's sphere. Can you imagine? Well, seeing the great need and unwilling to be put off, a group of women organized themselves as the Daughters of Temperance, and I joined the group that formed in Canajoharie. I actually made my first public speech at a Daughters of Temperance meeting in the village, where we were attempting to interest others in our cause. Few women at that time could have been persuaded to address an audience of men and women. But as a Quaker whose grandmother and aunts had always spoken at meeting when the Spirit moved them, I was ready to speak about a cause that I deeply believed in. Although there was some talk about me in my speech in the village the next day, only a few people criticized me for speaking in public as a woman. I kept busy with my teaching and my temperance work, but I read in a local newspaper in July of 1848 about a women's rights convention that had been organized in Seneca Falls, New York by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and other Quaker women. Although 300 people attended, the paper reported rather scornfully that the women had issued a declaration of sentiments announcing themselves as men's equals. They had also protested against legal, economic, social, and educational discriminations, even asking for the vote. I was not shocked by this break with tradition by these women, but rather amused. Yet the presence of Mrs. Mott at the convention aroused my curiosity, since my father's Quaker friends in Rochester had had only praise for her. And I personally had heard her speak once when I was at the boarding school in Philadelphia. When I finally returned to the farm for vacation that August, I was surprised to learn that there had already been a second convention 2 weeks after the one in Seneca Falls. The Rochester Women's Rights Convention of 1848 was held at the Unitarian Church, which my family had started attending, drawn by its social reform work. Mother, father, my sister Mary, and several cousins had not only attended this convention, but had indeed signed the Declaration of Sentiments and the resolutions adopted at Seneca Falls. The enthusiasm of my family for this new women's rights movement and for both Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott made me decide to try to meet these women and talk with them while I was in Rochester. Unfortunately, there was no opportunity for me to do this prior to returning to Canajoharie to teach. This third year of teaching was one of great sadness for me, as my cousin Margaret, whom I dearly loved, died after being very seriously ill for a long time. I also became disenchanted with teaching, especially the pay inequality between males and females, and with a new uncongenial principal from the South whose father was a slaveholder. Thus, when the academy closed in 1849, I happily returned to my family and the farm, where I took over its management so that father could devote more time to his new growing insurance business. I decided then that teaching was behind me. I wanted to devote my time fully to reform work. Both my parents felt this was the path I should take in my life. And I was actually able to support myself for the rest of my life from the fees that I earned as a speaker for reform. My first meeting with Elizabeth Cady Stanton was totally happenstance. It took place on a street corner in Seneca Falls in 1851 and lasted only a few minutes. Knowing immediately that we needed to have more time to get to know one another, Mrs. Stanton, as I thereafter always called her, invited me to come and stay a while in her home. We soon discovered we had found a partner for life in our struggle for social reform and women's rights. We were quite different in temperament, but with complementary skills that allowed us to work together so effectively. Mrs. Stanton, who was kept close to home with a large family, provided the ideas, rhetoric, and strategy. Because I was unmarried, totally by choice, and free to travel, I rented the halls, delivered the speeches, circulated the petitions. I prodded, Mrs. Stanton produced. Or, as she liked to say, I forged the thunderbolts. Miss Anthony fired them. One of our first collaborative efforts occurred when Mrs. Stanton and I created the Women's State Temperance Society, and with her as president and me as New York State agent. This came about because I was refused the right to speak at the State Temperance Convention early in 1852, even though I was an elected delegate. I was told by the male chair that women delegates were there only to listen and learn. I and several other women immediately walked out and announced a meeting of our own. That occurred in Rochester in April with 500 women attending. My coworkers and I collected 28,000 signatures on a petition for a law to prohibit the sale of alcohol in New York State. We had a hearing on the law before the New York legislature, the first ever initiated in New York by a group of women. Unfortunately, the law didn't pass, and Mrs. Stanton and I were attacked at our organization's convention the following year for advocating for the right of a wife of an alcoholic husband to obtain a divorce. We decided that we needed to resign from the society. I was quite concerned about the lack of other rights for married women who were essentially treated as property of their husbands. This was also the interest of the minister at First Unitarian Church, which I had started attending. Reverend William Henry Channing and I organized a convention in Rochester to launch a state campaign for improved property rights for married women, building on an extremely limited 1848 law. I took my lecture and petition campaign into almost every county in New York during the winter of 1855. I ultimately presented the petitions to the New York State Senate Judiciary Committee, which disparaged them and sarcastically recommended the petitioners seek a law authorizing husbands in such marriages to wear petticoats and their wives' trousers. It took until 1860 for the legislature to pass a Married Women's Property Act that gave married women the rights to own their own property, enter into contracts, and be joint guardians of their children. Unfortunately, the legislature rolled back much of the law in 1862 when the women's movement was largely inactive due to the Civil War. As the Civil War approached, I increased my advocacy for abolition and organized a series of anti-slavery meetings under the banners reading, "No compromise with slaveholders, immediate and unconditional emancipation." I became the New York State agent for the American Anti-Slavery Society, but with the understanding that I would continue my advocacy for women's rights. With the encouragement of my friend Lucy Stone, who had been organizing the National Women's Rights Conventions for several years, I agreed to preside at the one in 1858. And when the planning committee for these conventions was reorganized, Mrs. Stanton became its president and I its secretary. I continued to travel throughout New York as the Civil War began, speaking on behalf of abolition and expressing my vision of a racially integrated society with full rights of citizenship for African Americans. My views at the time were quite radical, and they were not always well received by my audiences. I was escorted off the stage for my safety a number of times during that period. Mrs. Stanton and I organized the Women's Loyal National League in 1863 to campaign for what became the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Our organization conducted the largest petition drive in U.S. history up to that time, recruiting and coordinating the work of 2,000 collectors. We ultimately gathered 400,000 signatures, and this significantly assisted in the passage of the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery. Looking back, the League provided us with the opportunity to combine our fight against slavery with our fight for women's rights. It helped create a new generation of women leaders and demonstrated the value of formal structure to a movement that had resisted being anything than loosely organized until then. Our pool of talent for reform after the Civil War, including women's suffrage, grew immeasurably. One battle was won, the abolition of slavery, but there were more to be fought. Mrs. Stanton and I learned in 1865 that a 14th Amendment was being proposed to provide citizenship with equal rights to African Americans. But it also included for the first time the word male. I, of course, supported citizenship for African Americans, but opposed any attempt to link it with a reduction in status for women. As Mrs. Stanton said, if that word male be inserted, it will take us at least a century to get it out. Mrs. Stanton and I now turned our efforts towards reviving the women's rights movement and that had become nearly dormant during the Civil War. We organized the 11th National Women's Rights Convention, and from that we formed a new organization to campaign for equal rights for women and African Americans, including suffrage. In addition to Mrs. Stanton and myself, leaders of the American Equal Rights Association included Lucretia Mott, Lucy Stone, her husband Henry Blackwell, and Frederick Douglass. Conflict soon arose, however. Many of the abolitionist leaders with whom Mrs. Stanton and I had worked before and during the Civil War were now abandoning the cause of women in their pursuit of rights for African Americans alone. Mr. Douglass, who was a longtime friend of mine and a strong supporter of women's rights, withdrew from the association and decided to dedicate his time to getting the 14th Amendment passed as it was. Mrs. Stanton and I opposed the 14th Amendment as long as it excluded women. The growing split in the women's rights movement came to a head 2 days after the final American Equal Rights Association convention in 1869. Mrs. Stanton, I, and several others then founded the National Women's Suffrage Association, which opposed the 15th Amendment, which would prohibit the denial of suffrage because of race, but not sex. We continued to insist that women and African American men should have the vote at the same time. The NWSA also worked for a politically independent women's movement that would no longer be dependent on the Republican Party or abolitionists for support. NWSA focused on winning suffrage on the national level and worked on a wide range of women's issues, including divorce reform and equal pay for women. Lucy Stone, Henry Blackwell, Julia Ward Howe, and others soon seceded from our women's movement and formed the American Woman Suffrage Association, which included men. They were willing for African American men to achieve suffrage first and wanted to maintain close ties with the Republican Party and the abolitionist movement. They hoped ratification of the 15th Amendment would lead Republicans to push for women's suffrage. They also decided to pursue a state-by-state strategy to win the vote. Sadly, this split shattered the previous unanimity of our movement, and it forever wrecked my friendship with Lucy Stone. After formation of the NWSA, I dedicated myself fully to the organization and advocating for women's suffrage. Mrs. Stanton, who had been primarily working at home while caring for her 7 children, joined me on the lecture circuit about 1870. We did not always travel together, but went to different locations to lecture and bring new women into the movement, which helped to strengthen women's rights associations on the local, state, and national level. During the decade of the 1870s, it is said I covered a distance unmatched by any other reformer or politician. I also used these succeeding years to organize national conventions, lobby Congress and state legislatures, work in a series of state suffrage campaigns, and began writing a history of women's suffrage with Mrs. Stanton and Matilda Jocelyn Gage. I even traveled to Europe in 1883 to meet with leaders of the European women's movement and begin the process of creating an international organization, ultimately called the International Council of Women. I trained a group of younger activists, whom I called my nieces, to assume leadership roles in the NWSA. These included Carrie Chapman Catt and Anna Howard Shaw, who went on to become leaders in the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which was formed after the split in our movement was finally resolved in 1890. There's really so much more that I could tell you about the last decades of my life, but I want to focus on one event that was particularly significant for me and for the movement. In 1872, despite our best efforts to have women included, the 15th Amendment was ratified, giving African Americans the right to vote, but not women. The previous year, at the NWSA convention, we had adopted a strategy of urging women to attempt to vote. When turned away, they were to file suits in federal court challenging the laws preventing women from voting, using one part of the 14th Amendment as a legal basis. Quote, "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States," unquote. On Election Day, November the 5th, 1872, I, along with 14 other women from my ward, marched to the voting site and demanded that the 3 inspectors there allow us to vote. They refused, of course, but that did not stop me. I pulled out a copy of the 14th Amendment and then began reading it to them. When that didn't seem to make a difference, I started threatening them, saying, "If you still refuse us rights as citizens, I will bring charges against you in criminal court, and I will sue each of you personally for large exemplary damages. I know I can win." They talked among themselves for an hour and finally allowed us to register. Soon after, the women and I voted for the very first time. Our victory was short-lived, however. I was arrested on November the 18th by a U.S. deputy marshal in charge with voting illegally. The other women were also charged, as were the voting inspectors who let us vote. At a hearing on December 23rd, the other women were released on bail, but I refused to pay it. Angered by my attitude, the judge doubled the fine to $1,000, which I still refused to pay. I knew that if I did not pay, I could take my case to the Supreme Court of Appeals. But against my wishes, my lawyer paid the fine for me, saying he could not stand to see me behind bars. My trial wasn't scheduled for 6 months, so I knew exactly what I needed to do. I used the time to speak about women's rights throughout Monroe County, where my trial was to be held. I titled my speech, "Is it a crime for a citizen of the United States to vote?" And of course, I told them why it was not a crime, but simply an exercise of my citizen rights, guaranteed to me and all U.S. citizens by the Constitutions, beyond the power of any state to deny. Taking no chances that an all-male jury might be influenced by my public appearances, the trial was moved to a neighboring county. The United States versus Susan B. Anthony trial began on June 17, 1873. Following a common law rule at the time, I was prevented from testifying until the verdict was delivered. On the second day of the trial, after testimony from my counsel and the district attorney, the judge announced that there was no question of fact for the jury to decide, that I was a woman and I'd voted illegally. The judge directed the jury to find me guilty and preempted a defense motion to appeal. I was assessed a fine of $100 plus court costs, which I promptly announced I would not pay, and I never did. Since the judge did not order me to be jailed, the legal avenue for appeal to the Supreme Court was now closed to me. However, my loyal suffrage sisters donated enough money to print 10,000 copies of the trial proceedings, which were circulated throughout the United States. Thereafter, I began my speeches with the words, "I stand before you a convicted criminal." My trial and its outcome convinced me that the best way to achieve the vote for women was by amending the U.S. Constitution, so Washington, D.C. became our focus. I optimistically numbered this new amendment as the 16th, and it followed the wording of the 15th. Quote, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." Some of my nieces called it the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, but I protested, saying I did not draft it, and it was actually Mrs. Stanton who made the first public demand for women's suffrage back in 1848. Mrs. Stanton and I eventually arranged for Senator Aaron A. Sargent of California to introduce the amendment into Congress on January the 10th, 1878. As you know, it made no headway as the 16th Amendment, but it was reintroduced in the same form into each succeeding Congress until it was finally passed in 1919 as the 19th Amendment and was ratified by the states in 1920. In later years, I settled into my sister Mary's house in Rochester. Not that I wasn't active nationally after that. I even toured Yosemite National Park on the back of a mule at age 75. I remained a leader of the National American Women's Suffrage Association and continued to travel, including 8 months in California with their state campaign to win the vote for women. I resumed regular attendance at First Unitarian Church with my sister Mary and deepened my friendship with the minister, Reverend William Gannett, and his wife Mary, both social activists in Rochester. Mrs. Gannett and I were part of a long campaign to open the University of Rochester to women. University officials finally agreed in 1898 to admit women if $50,000 could be raised to defray costs. Much of the money had already been contributed in previous fundraising efforts, but the drive was still $8,000 short the evening before the deadline. I had just returned home from a trip to Wyoming, but I was determined to succeed and close the last-minute funding gap. Thus, I appealed to the members of First Unitarian Church and raised the entire balance of the money from them, including my sister Mary and I, and by the deadline. I cannot tell you how great the impact of Unitarianism was on my life and beliefs. Mrs. Stanton said this about me in 1898. She found words to express her convictions in listening to Reverend William Henry Channing, whose teachings had a lasting spiritual influence on her. Today, Miss Anthony is an agnostic. As to the nature of the Godhead and of the life beyond her horizon, she does not profess to know anything. Every energy of her soul is centered upon the needs of this world. To her, work is worship. Her belief is not orthodox, but it is religious. I later expressed this myself by saying, "Work and worship are one with me. I cannot imagine a God of the universe made happy by my getting down on my knees and calling him great." During the last 6 years of my life, I spoke at 6 more National American Women's Suffrage Association conventions and 4 congressional hearings, helped complete the 4th volume of the History of Women's Suffrage, and traveled to 18 states, as well as to Berlin for the founding of the International Women's Suffrage Alliance. The great sadness during this time was losing Mrs. Stanton, who died in 1902 at age 87. Although we had grown somewhat apart as we became older and had certain areas of disagreement, she had been my closest friend and partner in the cause of suffrage for 50 years. It was a great going out of my life. My final trip to Washington, D.C. was in February 1906 to meet with President Theodore Roosevelt to urge him to submit a suffrage amendment to Congress. I also attended the NAWSA meeting where I celebrated my 86th birthday. In my last message at the convention, after receiving a complimentary tribute from the president but no support for the amendment, I said, "When will men do something beyond extend congratulations? I would rather have President Roosevelt say one word to Congress in favor of amending the Constitution to give women the suffrage than to praise me endlessly." I finished my remarks by expressing my appreciation for the loyal support of my suffrage sisters. We little dreamed when we began this contest that half a century later, we would be compelled to leave the finish of the battle to another generation of women. But our hearts are filled with joy to know that they entered this task equipped with a college education, with business experience, with the freely admitted right to speak in public, all of which were denied to women 50 years ago. There have been others also just as true and devoted to the cause. I wish I could name every one. But with such women consecrating their lives, failure is impossible. I developed pneumonia traveling back to Rochester and died at home 3 weeks later on March the 13th, 1906. My sister Mary and Anna Howard Shaw were at my bedside. Well, I've come to the end of my narrative. I've spoken much about my work and life, and there is so much I have not had enough time to reveal. I am sure that you as Unitarians would have many questions of me if we could be together now and have a discussion. I'll leave you with these final words which I spoke in 1894, but which are still relevant. We shall someday be heated, and when we shall have our amendment to the Constitution of the United States, everybody will think it was always so, that just exactly as many young people think that all privileges, all the freedoms, all the enjoyments which women now possess always were hers. They have no idea how every single inch of ground that she stands upon today has been gained by the hard work of some small handful of women in the past. Thank you.
My life flows on in endless song, above earth's lamentation. I hear the wail, the far off hymn that hails a new creation. Through all the tumult and the strife, I hear the music ringing. It sounds an echo in my soul. How can I keep from singing? What though the tempest round me roars? I know the truth it liveth. What though the darkness round me glows? Songs in the night it giveth. No storm can shake my inmost calm, while to the rock I'm clinging. Since love prevails in heaven and earth, how can I keep from singing? When tyrants tremble as they hear the bells of freedom ringing, when friends rejoice both far and near, how can I keep from singing? To prison cell and dungeon vile, our thoughts to them are winging. When friends by shame are undefiled, how can I keep from singing?
Forget conventionalisms. Forget what the world thinks of you stepping out of your place. Think your best thoughts, speak your best words, work your best works. looking to your own conscience for approval.
We have spent time together, and these holy moments give us strength to go down the winding road until we meet again. We have spent